"Your seat has been moved, Helen," my son whispered at my late husband's memorial, like he was apologizing for a minor inconvenience instead of erasing me from my own marriage. I stood there in the entrance hall of St. Andrew's Church with my black gloves still in my hands, staring at the front row where I was supposed to sit beside Richard's memorial portrait. My name card was gone. In its place sat Patricia Green, my daughter-in-law's mother, wearing a pearl gray suit and the diamond brooch Richard had given me on our 40th wedding anniversary. For a moment, I honestly thought I was looking at the wrong row. The sanctuary smelled faintly of lilies and old wood polish, and soft piano music drifted through the room while guests spoke in hushed voices around me. Everything about the morning had been carefully arranged to honor my husband of 46 years. Or at least that was what I had believed. Daniel finally looked at me, but only briefly. "Vanessa thought Patricia should sit up front with family," he said quietly. Family. The word landed harder than I expected. I glanced toward Vanessa near the podium, greeting guests with practiced warmth, her hand resting lightly on Patricia's shoulder as though she were the widow receiving condolences. Neither of them looked surprised to see me standing there without a seat. That was the moment I realized this had been planned long before I walked through those church doors. I felt something cold settle inside my chest, colder even than the January wind outside. Richard's memorial wasn't beginning with grief. It was beginning with replacement. I could still remember the last time Richard and I sat together in this church just 6 months earlier during Christmas Eve service. He had squeezed my hand during the final hymn and whispered, "No matter what happens, you'll always be the heart of this family." At the time, I smiled because I thought it was simply one of those sentimental things people say after 70. I didn't realize he sounded worried. "There's a seat near the back," Daniel added awkwardly. He stepped aside before I could answer, already turning toward Patricia as she adjusted herself comfortably into my place beside Richard's framed photograph. Guests continued arriving. Some smiled at me politely before moving toward the front rows where Vanessa welcomed them like the hostess of a formal dinner party. Others glanced between Patricia and me with subtle confusion they were too polite to mention aloud. I walked slowly toward the last section of pews and sat alone near the rear aisle. From there, Richard's portrait looked distant, almost unreachable. Then I noticed something else. Patricia wasn't just wearing my brooch. She was wearing Richard's favorite silver watch too. The memorial service began exactly at 11 o'clock, just as Richard would have wanted. He had always believed that being late to church was disrespectful, even on ordinary Sundays. I sat quietly near the back pew while the organ music echoed softly through the sanctuary, watching strangers and relatives fill the seats around Patricia as though she truly belonged there. From a distance, she looked comfortable in my place. Too comfortable. Every now and then she leaned toward Vanessa while they whispered to each other with solemn expressions carefully arranged across their faces. I recognized that expression. Vanessa used it during charity events and neighborhood gatherings whenever she wanted people to think she was warm-hearted and graceful. It was never completely genuine. A woman from Richard's golf club approached Patricia before the service officially started. I could not hear everything clearly from where I sat, but I heard enough. "You must have been such a support to Richard through the years," the woman said softly. Patricia lowered her eyes modestly and squeezed the woman's hand. She did not correct her. Neither did Vanessa. I felt my fingers tighten around the folded memorial program resting in my lap. 46 years of marriage, and somehow another woman was now receiving condolences meant for me while my own son stood nearby pretending not to notice. The pastor began speaking about Richard's generosity, his kindness, the way he never missed one of Sophie's piano recitals even during his chemotherapy treatments. That nearly broke me. Not because of the memories themselves, but because Richard suddenly felt so far away from me inside that church. Every story about him now seemed filtered through Vanessa's carefully staged performance. When the pastor invited family members to share reflections, Vanessa stood first. Of course she did. She walked gracefully toward the podium in a fitted black dress, her voice trembling at exactly the right moments. She spoke about Richard teaching her how to grill steaks in the backyard during summer cookouts and how he always called her the daughter he never had. Several guests smiled warmly at her words. Daniel sat proudly beside Patricia in the front row. Then Vanessa invited Patricia to stand beside her for support while she finished speaking. I stared at the silver watch around Patricia's wrist again. Richard wore that watch almost every day for 20 years. I bought it for him after Daniel graduated from college. The engraving on the back read, "Forever my home." Suddenly, Sophie slipped quietly into the empty seat beside me. I had not even noticed her arrive. My granddaughter looked pale beneath the soft church lighting, her blonde hair tucked nervously behind her ears. She leaned closer without taking her eyes off the front row. "Grandma," she whispered carefully, "Dad gave Grandma Patricia Grandpa's watch last month. Mom said you would not notice because you were too distracted taking care of Grandpa." For several seconds, I could not speak at all. Then Sophie reached into her purse and placed something small into my trembling hand. It was the original seating card with my name still printed neatly across the front. I turned the seating card over carefully beneath the shadow of the church balcony, while the pastor continued speaking about devotion and family loyalty at the front of the sanctuary. My name was still there in black script. Helen Whitmore. Front row family seating. Someone had bent the edges slightly, as if it had been removed in a hurry. Sophie kept staring forward while Vanessa thanked guests for supporting our family during this difficult season. The words sounded polished and rehearsed, like lines memorized for a performance instead of grief spoken from the heart. "I found it. In the trash near the fellowship hall," Sophie whispered softly. "Mom told the event coordinator there had been a mistake with the cards." I looked at my granddaughter then. She was only 16, but there was already embarrassment in her eyes. Not childish confusion. Embarrassment. The kind people feel when they realize something ugly is happening in front of others and no one is willing to stop it. I folded the card slowly and slipped it into my purse beside my gloves. For the first time that morning, I stopped wondering whether I was imagining things. I was not. Richard's memorial had been carefully rearranged before I even arrived. Vanessa had not simply forgotten my seat. She had replaced me deliberately. The realization should have made me angry. Instead, it made me strangely calm. During the closing hymn, I found myself drifting backward through the years, remembering when Daniel still reached for my hand crossing parking lots and called every Sunday evening no matter how busy he was. That was before Vanessa entered our lives with her polished smile and perfectly measured kindness. At first, I truly welcomed her. Richard did too. She brought homemade pies to Thanksgiving dinners and sent me birthday flowers signed "Love Always." But slowly, little things changed after the wedding. Holiday plans began shifting to Patricia's house instead of ours. Family photos started appearing online where Richard and I were cropped near the edges. Vanessa always had explanations ready. "Oh, the lighting was better this way." "Oh, Patricia already bought matching pajamas for everyone." "Oh, we assumed you would be tired from the drive." None of it seemed cruel enough on its own. That was the clever part. The changes happened quietly, one small adjustment at a time, until suddenly I was sitting alone in the back row at my own husband's memorial, watching another woman wear my jewelry. After the service ended, guests gathered in the fellowship hall for coffee and sandwiches. I stayed near the doorway while people approached Patricia with sympathy-filled smiles. More than once I heard someone say, "Richard spoke so highly of you." Every time, Patricia accepted the kindness, without correcting them. Daniel stood nearby carrying her coat while Vanessa floated through the room introducing Patricia to distant relatives from Chicago and Denver like she was the center of the Whitmore family. Then I noticed something else. Resting beside Patricia's purse on the refreshment table was Richard's leather-bound memorial planner. The same planner he kept locked in his office desk drawer for nearly 20 years. Seeing Richard's memorial planner in Patricia's possession unsettled me more than the missing seat or even the stolen brooch. Richard guarded that planner carefully for years. It was where he wrote everything important that he did not trust himself to forget. Appointments, family birthdays, property taxes, notes about Sophie's school concerts. Sometimes little private thoughts he never intended anyone else to read. He kept it inside the bottom drawer of his office desk, beside old warranty papers and our marriage certificate. Even Daniel rarely touched it growing up because Richard called it the family map. And now Patricia was casually setting it beside her purse while accepting sympathy from guests who believed she belonged at the center of Richard's life. I stood near the coffee station pretending to stir powdered creamer into a paper cup while Vanessa laughed softly across the room with two women from church. The sound drifted toward me in small polished bursts. Everything about her looked controlled. Her makeup remained perfect despite the long morning. Her posture never slumped. Even her grief seemed measured and elegant, like something practiced in front of a mirror. Then I remembered another afternoon nearly 12 years earlier, just after Daniel introduced Vanessa to us for the first time. Richard had grilled hamburgers in the backyard, while Vanessa complimented everything she saw. The garden, the patio furniture, my homemade potato salad. She asked thoughtful questions about our family traditions and smiled every time Richard spoke. On the drive home that evening, Richard squeezed my hand and said, "She knows exactly how to make people comfortable." At the time, he meant it kindly. Looking back now, I realized comfort was Vanessa's greatest weapon. People trusted her because she never pushed too hard all at once. She simply adjusted things slowly until they no longer belonged to you. I noticed Daniel approaching me with 2 paper cups of coffee in his hands. He hesitated before offering one to me, almost like a nervous employee trying to avoid conflict with a customer. "You doing okay, Mom?" he asked quietly. Mom. The word sounded unfamiliar coming from him now. I accepted the coffee and nodded politely. Up close, he looked exhausted. Dark circles shadowed beneath his eyes, and there was gray beginning to spread near his temples that reminded me painfully of Richard. For one brief second, I wanted to reach up and smooth his hair back the way I used to after Little League games. Instead, I simply asked, "Why does Patricia have your father's planner?" Daniel blinked quickly. Vanessa thought it would help organize memorial details. He answered too fast. There were a lot of moving parts. I stared at him for several seconds. Richard had been gone only 3 weeks. 3 weeks. And already strangers were carrying his private belongings around like event supplies. Before I could say anything else, Vanessa appeared beside Daniel and slipped her arm gently through his. "Everyone is waiting for family photos near the chapel entrance," she said with a bright, sympathetic smile. Then she looked directly at me and added, "We already arranged the order for seating and pictures so things stay simple today." Simple. That word stayed with me long after she walked away because suddenly I understood exactly what she meant. Simple meant quiet. Simple meant obedient. Simple meant I was expected to disappear gracefully while someone else stepped into my place. The family photographs began immediately after the memorial luncheon ended, and somehow that felt worse than the service itself. At least during the prayers and hymns, people had pretended to respect grief. But the moment cameras appeared near the chapel entrance, the performance shifted completely. Vanessa stood near the flower arrangements, organizing everyone with cheerful authority, while Daniel carried folding chairs from one side of the room to the other. Patricia remained close beside them both, touching Daniel's arm occasionally as though she had belonged in our family for decades instead of barely 10 years. I stayed near the stone wall outside the chapel holding my coat closed against the cold January air. Nobody told me where to stand. Nobody asked whether I wanted to be included in certain photographs. They simply moved around me naturally, the way people move around furniture they no longer notice. "Okay, immediate family first," Vanessa called brightly to the photographer. The words echoed strangely in my ears. Immediate family. Daniel stepped beside Patricia and rested his hand gently on her shoulder, while Sophie reluctantly joined them near the front steps. Vanessa positioned herself between Daniel and Patricia with effortless confidence. The photographer glanced toward me politely. "Would you like to join this one too?" he asked. Before I could answer, Vanessa smiled sympathetically and said, "Oh, Helen prefers quieter moments. Crowds are overwhelming for her lately." As though grief had already transformed me into someone fragile and inconvenient. I looked at Daniel then, waiting for him to correct her. He did not. Instead, he stared down at the stone pavement while Patricia adjusted Richard's silver watch on her wrist. Something inside me went still after that. Not shattered. Not broken. Just still. Like a lake freezing over in winter. Sophie suddenly stepped out of the group and walked toward me instead. Vanessa's smile flickered for half a second before returning. "Sweetheart," she called carefully, "we are taking the family portrait." Sophie wrapped her arm quietly through mine. "Grandma is family," she answered. Nobody spoke after that. The photographer shifted awkwardly while several relatives exchanged uncomfortable glances. Patricia looked away first. Daniel finally cleared his throat and muttered, "Soph, just cooperate for a few minutes." But Sophie remained beside me. I could feel her trembling slightly through her coat sleeve. She was frightened of disappointing her parents, yet she stayed anyway. That simple gesture nearly brought me to tears more than anything else that day. We took the photograph together in strained silence. Vanessa smiled perfectly for every camera flash, but her eyes looked colder each time she glanced toward me. Afterward, guests slowly began leaving the church parking lot while sunset painted the winter sky pale gray and gold. I walked alone toward my car parked near the far edge of the lot where patches of old snow still clung to the pavement. As I reached for my keys, Sophie hurried toward me holding her phone tightly against her chest. "Grandma," she whispered breathlessly, checking over her shoulder first, "I need to show you something before Mom deletes it." Then she opened a video recording from earlier that morning. Vanessa's voice filled the screen softly, but clearly. "Once Helen moves out of the house," she said calmly, "everything finally becomes manageable." I did not play the recording again until after I arrived home that evening. The house felt painfully quiet without Richard there to loosen his tie in the kitchen doorway or ask whether I wanted tea before bed. Snow had begun falling lightly outside, dusting the back deck and the bare maple trees in silver white. I stood alone in the darkened living room, still wearing my black memorial coat, while Vanessa's voice played softly from Sophie's phone once more. "Once Helen moves out of the house, everything finally becomes manageable." Manageable. Not heartbreaking. Not unfortunate. Just manageable. As though I were an obstacle cluttering their future plans instead of the woman who built that home room by room beside Richard for nearly half a century. I sat slowly on the edge of the sofa and looked around the living room. Richard's reading glasses still rested beside his favorite chair. His unfinished crossword puzzle remained folded on the side table exactly where he left it 3 weeks earlier. Suddenly, the entire house felt fragile, like something already being divided in other people's minds while I was still learning how to breathe without him. I carried Sophie's phone carefully into Richard's office and closed the door behind me. The office always smelled faintly of cedarwood and old paper. Richard loved that room. He used to spend Sunday mornings balancing bills there while jazz records played softly in the background. Even during his illness, he insisted on organizing every file himself because, as he often joked, nobody else can understand my system. I sat at his desk and opened the bottom drawer where he kept important family documents. For a moment, I simply stared. Several folders were missing. The empty spaces stood out immediately because Richard arranged everything with military precision. Property records. Insurance binders. Investment statements. Gone. My pulse quickened slightly. I opened the second drawer. Empty spaces there too. Somebody had been inside this office recently and knew exactly what they were searching for. I leaned back slowly in Richard's chair, trying to steady my breathing. Then another memory surfaced unexpectedly. About 8 months before he died, Richard came into the kitchen unusually quiet after dinner. He stood beside the sink for a long moment, drying the same plate twice before finally saying, "Promise me something, Helen." I laughed softly at the time because he sounded so serious. "That depends," I told him. "Promise me that if people start acting differently after I am gone, you will pay attention to actions instead of words." I remember teasing him for sounding dramatic. Richard only smiled faintly and kissed my forehead. "I just want you protected." At the time, I assumed he meant emotionally protected from grief. Now, sitting alone in his office with half his files missing, I realized he may have meant something entirely different. A sudden knock startled me. Daniel stepped cautiously into the doorway holding his car keys. "Mom, why are you sitting in the dark?" he asked. I studied my son carefully for several seconds before answering. Where are your father's financial folders? His expression changed too quickly. Not shock. Not confusion. Fear. Daniel remained standing in the doorway with one hand still wrapped around his car keys, while snow drifted softly outside the office windows behind him. For a moment neither of us spoke. I could hear the grandfather clock ticking steadily in the hallway and the faint hum of the furnace turning. On downstairs. Ordinary sounds. Familiar sounds. Yet everything inside that room suddenly felt unfamiliar to me. What financial folders? Daniel finally asked, but his voice lacked conviction. He sounded like a boy caught lying before he had time to prepare an excuse. I looked back toward the empty spaces inside Richard's desk drawer. The property records are missing. So are the investment files. Daniel stepped into the office slowly and rubbed the back of his neck the same way he used to before difficult school exams. Vanessa thought it would help if we organized paperwork early, he said carefully. There is just a lot to handle right now. Organized. Another harmless-sounding word hiding something ugly underneath. I closed the drawer gently. Without asking me? He hesitated long enough to answer the question without speaking. My son had never been a strong liar. Even as a child, guilt always reached his face before the words arrived. Mom, he said quietly, Vanessa is only trying to make things easier on everybody. Everybody. Not you. Not us. Everybody. I studied him in the dim office light and realized how exhausted he truly looked. Not just tired from grief. Cornered. Like a man trying desperately to hold together pieces of a life already slipping beyond his control. Did your father ask you to remove those files before he died? I asked softly. Daniel's eyes shifted downward immediately. No, the answer came almost too fast. I folded my hands together in my lap and nodded once. Richard used to tell me that silence unsettled dishonest people more than anger ever could. So I stayed silent. After several uncomfortable seconds, Daniel cleared his throat and walked toward the bookshelf near the fireplace. You are reading too much into things, he muttered. Vanessa has been doing her best to help after everything that happened. Then his eyes landed briefly on Sophie's phone resting beside me on the desk. Something flickered across his expression. Why does Sophie keep recording people lately? He asked suddenly. There it was. Fear again. Quiet, but unmistakable. I picked up the phone calmly. Perhaps because she notices more than you think. Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, the doorbell rang downstairs. He looked relieved by the interruption. That is probably Martin Keller, he said quickly. He wanted to stop by tonight about some paperwork Dad left behind. Martin Keller. Richard's attorney and closest friend for over 30 years. My stomach tightened slightly. Richard trusted Martin with everything from our wills to Sophie's college trust fund. If Martin was arriving unannounced the same night I discovered missing files, then Richard may have expected problems long before his death. Daniel disappeared downstairs while I remained alone in the office for another moment staring at Richard's empty desk chair. Then I noticed something tucked beneath the lamp base near the corner of the desk. A small brass key attached to a white label written in Richard's handwriting. Safe Deposit Box 214. Martin Keller arrived carrying snow across the front porch on the shoulders of his charcoal wool coat. He looked older than I remembered from Richard's hospital visits during those final months, his silver hair thinner and his face drawn with exhaustion. Yet the moment he stepped inside the house, his eyes searched past Daniel immediately until they found me standing near the staircase. Something unspoken passed across his expression then. Concern. Not sympathy. Concern. Helen, he said quietly, removing his gloves. I was hoping to speak with you privately tonight if possible. Vanessa appeared from the kitchen before Daniel could answer. She carried a tray of untouched memorial pastries arranged neatly on china plates as though she already belonged there permanently. Martin, thank you for coming, she said warmly. We were just discussing how overwhelming all the paperwork has been. Martin nodded politely but did not smile back. I imagine it has. There was something careful in his tone that Vanessa noticed immediately because her posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. Daniel offered Martin coffee while I remained near the staircase holding Richard's brass key tightly inside my coat pocket. The metal felt cold against my palm. Actually, Martin continued after a brief pause. Richard specifically requested that certain matters be discussed with Helen directly. Silence settled across the room for one uncomfortable second too long. Vanessa recovered first. "Of course," she said smoothly. "We are all family here, though." Martin finally looked directly at her then. "Not for this matter." I saw Daniel glance nervously between them. Vanessa's smile remained intact, but her fingers tightened around the edge of the serving tray. For years I had watched her control rooms effortlessly through charm alone. Tonight, for the first time, someone refused to follow her lead. Martin waited until Daniel and Vanessa disappeared into the kitchen before speaking again. "Did Richard ever mention a safe deposit box to you?" he asked quietly. I reached into my coat pocket and showed him the brass key without answering. His shoulders relaxed slightly. "Good," he murmured. Then he trusted his instincts. The words sent a chill through me stronger than the winter storm outside. Martin removed a sealed envelope from his leather briefcase and handed it carefully to me. My name was written across the front in Richard's handwriting. Not shaky from illness. Strong and deliberate. "Richard instructed me to give you that only if certain behaviors started appearing after his death," Martin explained softly. "Particularly concerning the house, financial records, or attempts to isolate you from family decisions." I stared at the envelope without opening it yet. He expected this? Martin hesitated before answering. Richard noticed changes over the past year. He did not want to believe what he was seeing, but he prepared anyway. Somewhere in the kitchen, Vanessa laughed too loudly at something Daniel said. The sound floated sharply through the house like glass tapping against stone. Martin lowered his voice further. "Helen, before Richard died, he changed several legal arrangements connected to the estate." My pulse quickened. "What kind of arrangements?" He looked toward the kitchen doorway first before replying carefully. "The kind that only activate if someone mistakes your grief for weakness." After Martin left that night, I carried Richard's envelope upstairs to our bedroom but did not open it immediately. The room still smelled faintly of his aftershave and cedar soap, a scent that lingered stubbornly in the curtains and sweaters hanging inside the closet. Snow tapped softly against the bedroom windows while the house settled into uneasy silence below me. I sat on the edge of the bed turning the envelope over carefully in my hands. Richard's handwriting looked steady. Intentional. Not the shaky script from his final hospital days. Whatever he wrote inside this envelope, he wrote while his mind was clear. Eventually, I slid one finger beneath the seal and unfolded the letter inside. "Helen, if you are reading this, then certain people have already started showing you who they truly are." I paused there for a long moment because even seeing Richard's words again felt almost unbearable. I could practically hear his voice speaking them aloud. I continued reading slowly beneath the soft glow of the bedside lamp. I spent months convincing myself I was imagining things. But patterns eventually become impossible to ignore. Vanessa's influence over Daniel changed more than family schedules. It changed loyalty. If they begin pressuring you about the house, finances, or your place in this family, I need you to remember something very clearly. You are not dependent on them. My hands trembled slightly against the paper. Richard had known. Not everything perhaps, but enough. The letter continued with precise instructions. "Tomorrow morning, visit safe deposit box 214 at Whitmore Federal Bank. Martin already has authorization paperwork prepared for you. Do not discuss this with Daniel or Vanessa until after the estate meeting. Most importantly, trust behavior over apologies." Richard always believed actions revealed truth long before words did. I folded the letter carefully just as footsteps approached outside the bedroom door. Vanessa appeared a second later carrying folded towels against her chest. "I thought you might need extra blankets tonight," she said gently. Her voice sounded almost tender. Anyone overhearing us would have believed she was a thoughtful daughter-in-law caring for a grieving widow. She stepped inside before I could answer and glanced briefly toward the letter in my lap. Only for half a second. But I noticed. Vanessa noticed everything. "Today was difficult for all of us," she continued softly while placing towels near the dresser. "Daniel is especially worried about you being alone in such a large house now." There it was again. The house. Always circling back to the house. I looked at her calmly. I have managed this house for 46 years. Vanessa smiled sympathetically, though something colder moved beneath her expression. Of course. But eventually practical decisions become necessary. Practical. Manageable. Organized. Every cruel intention wrapped carefully inside harmless words. She moved toward the doorway, then paused. Patricia mentioned you seemed upset earlier about the memorial seating, she added lightly. I hope you understand nobody meant to hurt your feelings. Hurt feelings. As though humiliation could be reduced to oversensitivity. I waited until she disappeared downstairs before unfolding Richard's letter once more. Near the bottom, one final sentence had been underlined twice in dark blue ink. If anyone tries to make you feel like a guest inside your own life, Helen, they have already forgotten whose foundation they are standing on. The next morning, I drove to Whitmore Federal Bank through 6 inches of fresh snow with Richard's letter folded carefully inside my purse beside the brass key. The roads were quiet except for snowplows pushing gray slush toward the curbs, and the entire town looked muted beneath the pale January sky. I kept hearing Richard's words in my mind during the drive. Trust behavior over apologies. By the time I parked outside the bank, I no longer felt confused about what was happening inside my family. Grief had clouded me at first, but now the picture was sharpening painfully into focus. Martin Keller was already waiting near the lobby entrance when I arrived. He carried a leather folder tucked beneath one arm and looked around cautiously before greeting me. Did anyone question where you were going this morning? He asked quietly. I shook my head. Daniel had already left for work before sunrise, and Vanessa seemed too busy rearranging kitchen cabinets when I came downstairs to pay attention. Martin nodded once and guided me toward a private office near the back of the bank where a manager named Elaine greeted us with solemn professionalism. After signing several authorization forms, Elaine disappeared briefly and returned carrying a small black lockbox marked 214. My pulse quickened unexpectedly as she placed it on the polished conference table in front of me. Richard had prepared this box knowing one day I might need it after he was gone. That realization alone nearly unraveled me. Once Elaine left the room, Martin gestured toward the brass key in my hand. Take your time, he said softly. The lock clicked open with surprising ease. Inside rested several neatly organized folders, 2 flash drives, and another handwritten letter from Richard placed carefully on top. But what immediately caught my attention were the photographs. Dozens of them. Printed screenshots of text messages, emails, and financial transfer records clipped together with handwritten notes in Richard's familiar blue ink. My stomach tightened as I lifted the first bundle. One screenshot showed Vanessa messaging Patricia 6 months earlier. Once Richard passes, Helen will not know how to manage everything alone. Another read, Daniel already agrees the house is too much for her now. I stared at the pages in disbelief while Martin remained silent beside me. Richard had documented everything quietly while pretending not to notice. Another folder contained copies of property records with highlighted sections showing recent attempts to access ownership information for the house before Richard even died. Vanessa's name appeared repeatedly beside consultation requests. So did Patricia's. Richard hired a private investigator last summer, Martin said carefully. At first, he thought he was overreacting. But after certain financial inquiries began appearing, he wanted records. My hands trembled slightly as I turned another page. There were transcripts of phone calls, notes from meetings, even copies of online listings for senior living communities circled in red ink. One brochure had Vanessa's handwriting across the top corner. Quiet luxury options near downtown. I closed my eyes briefly. They had already been planning my removal while Richard was still alive. Then Martin slid one final document toward me. This, he said quietly, is the part they do not know about yet. At the top of the page, beneath Richard's signature and official notarization stamps, were the words Conditional Estate Transfer Revocation. I read the document 3 times before the meaning fully settled into my mind. Richard had rewritten portions of the estate 6 months earlier with a conditional clause attached to Daniel's inheritance rights. If any immediate family member attempted to remove me from the marital home, pressure me into assisted living against my wishes, manipulate estate access, or publicly diminish my status within the family during the first year after Richard's death. Daniel's controlling share of the Whitmore estate would automatically transfer into a protected trust under my authority alone. The language was precise, ruthless in its clarity. Richard had anticipated everything. My throat tightened painfully as I stared at his signature at the bottom of the page. Even while dying, he had still been trying to protect me. "Does Daniel know about this?" I asked quietly. Martin shook his head. "No. Richard instructed me to reveal it only after sufficient evidence existed that the conditions had been triggered." I looked down at the folders spread across the conference table. The memorial seating change. The missing financial files. The recordings. The senior living research. Patricia wearing my belongings at the church. Every small humiliation suddenly connected into one undeniable pattern. Martin slid another folder toward me. "There is more." Inside were photographs from the memorial service itself. Not taken by guests. Taken by the private investigator Richard hired months earlier. Vanessa speaking privately with the event coordinator beside the seating chart. Patricia being handed Richard's watch in the church parking lot before guests arrived. Daniel removing my original seating card from the front pew while Vanessa watched. I felt something inside me harden quietly. Not rage. Clarity. The worst part was not the manipulation itself. It was realizing Richard had spent his final months watching people he loved slowly prepare to replace me once he was gone. "What happens now?" I asked after a long silence. Martin folded his hands together carefully. "Tomorrow afternoon the formal estate reading takes place at my office." Richard anticipated they would arrive expecting control of everything. And instead, Martin met my eyes steadily. Instead, Richard arranged for the truth to arrive first. When I returned home later that afternoon, the house smelled faintly of cinnamon candles and furniture polish. Vanessa had already transformed the dining room into something that looked staged for a magazine photo shoot. Fresh flowers sat in crystal vases. Richard's old leather chair had been removed completely from the living room. In its place stood a pale cream accent chair that looked expensive and deeply unfamiliar. Vanessa smiled brightly when I entered carrying my purse and winter coat. "Perfect timing," she said warmly. "Patricia is joining us for dinner tonight. We thought it would be nice to start creating positive memories together again." Positive memories. I looked toward the dining table where Patricia was already seated beside Daniel sipping wine from one of my crystal glasses. Richard's crystal glasses. Nobody asked whether I minded the changes in the living room. Nobody mentioned the missing chair. They had already started redesigning the house emotionally before touching ownership legally. Daniel stood awkwardly as I removed my gloves. "Mom, tomorrow after the estate meeting, maybe we should discuss long-term plans for the property." Property. Not home. Property. I looked at my son for several seconds before answering calmly. "That sounds like an important conversation, Daniel." Vanessa smiled with visible relief, mistaking my calmness for surrender. Richard had predicted that too. The estate meeting took place the following afternoon inside Martin Keller's downtown office overlooking the frozen riverfront. Vanessa arrived wearing a cream-colored coat and pearl earrings that once belonged to Richard's mother. Patricia sat beside her, holding a leather notebook against her lap like she expected to participate in family decisions officially now. Daniel looked tense from the moment we entered the conference room, though Vanessa kept touching his arm reassuringly whenever he drifted into silence. I sat quietly near the far end of the table with Richard's final letter folded inside my purse. Martin entered carrying several thick folders before taking his seat at the head of the table. The room smelled faintly of coffee and paper, and outside the large windows snow drifted slowly across the gray Chicago streets below. Richard Whitmore updated his estate documents approximately 6 months ago, Martin began calmly. Vanessa smiled politely at first. She probably expected investment summaries and property distributions. Nothing more. Martin continued reading for nearly 20 minutes, outlining trusts, charitable donations, and Sophie's education fund. Daniel gradually relaxed beside Vanessa while Patricia occasionally nodded as though silently approving arrangements that did not belong to her. Then Martin opened the final folder. The atmosphere in the room changed immediately. Certain inheritance structures, he said carefully, were made conditional based on posthumous family conduct toward Mrs. Helen Whitmore. Vanessa's posture stiffened almost invisibly. Daniel frowned slightly. Martin placed several photographs and printed records onto the conference table one by one. The memorial seating arrangement. Vanessa speaking with the coordinator. Daniel removing my name card. Financial inquiries regarding the house. Senior living brochures. Patricia wearing Richard's personal belongings before estate transfer authorization. Nobody spoke. The silence became unbearable. Finally, Daniel looked toward Vanessa with visible confusion. You said the memorial seating was accidental. Vanessa recovered quickly. This is absurd, she replied sharply. We were only trying to help Helen adjust. Martin slid the final document across the table. Under Richard Whitmore's conditional estate transfer revocation clause, any attempt to diminish Mrs. Whitmore's family standing, pressure relocation, or manipulate estate access within 12 months of his death immediately revokes Daniel Whitmore's controlling inheritance authority. Daniel stared at the document without moving. What does that mean? He asked hoarsely. Martin answered quietly. It means the Whitmore estate, including the house and all associated assets, now transfers into Helen Whitmore's sole protected trust authority. Patricia's face drained of color first. Vanessa looked genuinely stunned for the first time since I had known her. That cannot be legal, she whispered. Martin folded his hands calmly. It already is. Daniel turned slowly toward me then, his expression somewhere between betrayal and realization. But I felt strangely peaceful sitting there. Not victorious. Just awake. Richard had seen the truth before I did. He had simply waited for me to see it too. Vanessa finally spoke again, softer this time. Helen, surely we can discuss this privately as a family. Family. The words sounded very different now. I stood slowly and gathered my gloves from the table. No, I said calmly. Families do not replace widows at memorial services. Nobody followed me as I walked toward the office door. Outside, snow continued falling gently across the city, while church bells echoed faintly in the distance. For the first time since Richard died, I no longer felt like a guest standing at the edge of my own life. I finally understood something my husband had known all along. People who try to erase you usually forget one important detail. They are standing inside a story you helped build.